So welcome back for our last discussion. As you can remember, we already tackled the curriculum planning in our previous video. Now we will dig deeper on the curriculum designing and organization. So before discussing what is curriculum designing and organization, let us first define what is curriculum design. So according to Switzer 2019, curriculum design is a term used to describe the purposeful, deliberate, and systematic organization of curriculum within a class or a course. So in other words, it is a way for teachers to plan instruction. When teachers design curriculum, they identify what will be done, who will do it, and what schedule to follow. So according to Switzer, curriculum design is a term that gives meaning and direction to the elements of curriculum. It is when teachers or the instructors plan and organize the instructional units of a particular course. So when the teachers design curriculum, they consider what will be done, who will do it, and what schedule to follow. We also have the definition came from Ryan 2020. According to him, curriculum design focuses on the creation of the overall course blueprint, mapping content to learning objectives, including how to develop a course outline and build a course. So each learning objective is met with assessment strategies, exercises, content, subject matter analysis, and interactive activities. So similarly, according to Ryan, curriculum design is concerned on the overall course blueprint that involves the decision making regarding to its content and target learning objectives. So each objective can be met through the use of assessment strategies, exercises, content, subject matter analysis, and interactive activities that will be done in the process of curriculum designing. So upon knowing the definition of curriculum design, let us now move on to the types of curriculum design. First, we have the subject-centered design. According to IGI Global, it is a traditional curriculum design that consists of students receiving lectures from teachers, reading textbooks, and regurgitating information and the assessment within a very specific time frame. So it is a traditional curriculum design that allows the students to passively receive lectures from their teachers and doing tasks or activities following a very specific time frame. Next, this curriculum design describes what needs to be studied and how it should be studied. So in here, teachers are given a list of topics or lessons that they need to teach and how these things should be taught to the students. Furthermore, it revolves around a particular subject matter or discipline. So it focuses on the subject rather than the learners or rather than the individual. Lastly, subject-centered design is indeed not a student-centered. So this curriculum design does not take into account or does not consider the specific learning styles of the student. And that is the subject-centered design. Let us now move on to the learner-centered design of curriculum. According to Edupedia, it encourages students to find their passions and paths in education and follow them, resulting in students gaining their structures of knowledge rather than simply being carriers of a standard identical knowledge base imparted to all students. So, opposite of what subject-centered curriculum design is, this form of curriculum design encourages the students to understand and assess themselves, in which can lead them to discover their paths in education. Next, this curriculum design takes each individual's needs, interests, and goals into consideration. So this curriculum design acknowledges that students are not static. The focus is to consider the learner's needs, interests, and goals. Furthermore, it is meant to empower learners and allow them to shape their education through choices. So in this design, instructional plans are varied that allows the students to choose assignments and activities and other learning experiences. So this will help them to be engaged with the learning process. Lastly, learner-centered design, as you can as we can infer, it is labor intensive. Why? Constructing differentiated instruction puts a lot of time and pressure on the teacher to create instruction and find materials that best suits to students' learning needs, and that is the learner-centered design. Lastly, we have the problem-centered design. According to IGI Global, it is a curriculum design that also uses a student approach, but that instructs students to look at a problem or situation and figure out a way to solve it. So teachers expect students to use their real life experiences to determine an answer. So this curriculum design also uses a student approach that enables the students to look at a problem or in a situation and find a way to solve it afterwards. So teachers may provoke students to use their real life experiences in formulating solutions to a particular problem. Moreover, it is also a form of a student-centered design. So if we are going to observe, it is also a form of a student-centered design of curriculum. It also focuses on teaching students how to look at a problem and come up with a solution to the problem. So as what I have said a while ago, this curriculum design focuses on teaching students how to look at a problem and find a way to solve it. Lastly, in here, students are exposed to real-life issues, which helps them develop skills that are transferable to the real world. So therefore, students should be exposed to real-life issues that will assist them to develop the skills that can be used to real-life situations. So upon knowing the types of curriculum design, let us now move on to the elements of designing a curriculum. So let us now look on the major elements in designing a curriculum. First, we have the intended learning outcomes. In here, what learning outcomes need to be achieved. Next, we have the subject matter or the content and references. For the subject matter, what content should be included to achieve the learning outcomes. Next, we also have the teaching and learning methods. In here, it answers the question, what learning experiences and resources shall be employed. Lastly, of course, we have the assessment or the evaluation. It answers the question, how will the achieved learning outcomes be measured? Let us now move on the intended learning outcomes. The first element in designing a curriculum. So intended learning outcomes, or the ILO, or the desired learning outcomes, was formerly labeled as behavioral objectives. So was formerly called as behavioral objectives, as what I have been stated in my presentation. The intended learning outcomes are the statements of what students are expected to be able to do as a result of engaging in the learning process. So, intended learning outcomes are statements that describe what students should know or be able to do at the end of the course and after engaging in the learning process. So, the intended learning outcomes are expressed or stated from first, the student's perspective, second, in the form of action verbs, and lastly, related to criteria for assessing student performance. So, in writing the intended learning outcomes, there are 5 essential steps or process that needs to be considered. According to University of Tasmania, these 5 steps or process entails first to decide on the purpose, next is to identify the content, then select the appropriate verb, fourth is to add the context, fifth is to ensure the clarity. So for the first step in designing the intended learning outcome, we have the purpose. So the first step in developing learning outcomes for a unit of study is to identify the purpose of the unit. So this can be done by considering the questions, why is the unit being offered? Next, what is that students need to learn in this unit? Next, what would you like the student to say? You also have the question, what specific skills will a student leave the unit with that they lacked when they started? And lastly, what will every student who passes this unit know, understand, and be able to do at the end of the course? So I have here an example of a intended learning outcome that greatly depicts the purpose. So I will read it. Then I will read the example. In here, students will understand Newton's three laws of motion and the revolution. These were in the understanding and explanation of motion. They will be able to explain the concept of objects in linear and in rotational motion. They will understand the relationships between motion, force, and energy. And that is the step 1, which is deciding on the purpose. Next, we have the content. So in developing each intended learning outcome for a unit, it is recommended that you start by defining the content that the student will learn within the unit, and which is defined within the purpose of previously identified. So after defining the purpose, it is suggested that one should start defining the content that the student will be able to learn. Thus, when there are more than one identified purposes found in the same content, it is suggested or recommended to merge this into a single intended learning outcomes, as what have been stated in the example of the content of an intended learning outcome that emphasizes the content. Newton's three laws of motion, what they are, impact they have, and the concept of objects in linear and in rotational motion, the relationships between motion, force, and energy. Next step is we have the verb. So once the content has been defined, consider the level of cognitive activity which the student will be expected to engage. So in an intended learning outcome, this level of cognitive engagement can be expressed with a verb. So this identifies what the student is expected to do with the content. So we have here the example of an ILO, that the verbs used in writing an intended learning outcome. We have the verb describe, explain, generalize, and many more. So in here, the third step in designing the intended learning outcomes. So after defining the content, consider the level of the cognitive activity. Thus, the level of students' cognitive engagement can be distinguished and expressed with a verb. So to guide you in choosing appropriate verb that focuses on cognitive level, you might use Benjamin Bloom's revised taxonomy and Andrew Church's updated Bloom's digital taxonomy. As you can remember, in our previous discussions, in educational objectives, we have three major domains, which entails the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor domains. So for the cognitive domain, we have you might consider Benjamin's Bloom's taxonomy and the revised version of Bloom's digital taxonomy by Andrew Churches. So in discussing these various taxonomy, we will just briefly, I will just give you the gist of each taxonomy for you to understand its concept and its role in designing the intended learning outcome. So for the Bloom's taxonomy and for the cognitive domain, I have here the representation of his model. So from the 1956 framework for categorizing educational goals or objectives, it was revised by Lauren Anderson with other collaborators, published in 2001. From the noun form, they changed it to verb form. So according to Shank 2013, the main reason in revising Bloom's taxonomy was the incorporation of new methods of instruction and learning. Next, we have the Bloom's digital taxonomy. So Andrew Churches revised Bloom's work then introduced Bloom's digital taxonomy in 2007. So the main reason is to integrate Bloom's taxonomy to 21st century digital skills. So learners might develop a script. So in here, in Bloom's digital taxonomy, the learners might develop a script for a video, construct an ebook, etc. So and that is for the cognitive levels. So in considering the affective domain, it is useful to look into Krathwohl's taxonomy. So I have here the Krathwohl's taxonomy for the affective domain. So we all know that affective domain describes the learning objectives that highlights a feeling, tone, or emotion. So Krathwohl's taxonomy was first described by David Krathwohl in 1964. So this will encourage students to not just receive the information but rather to respond to it, value it, organize it, and consistently act with the new value. And that is Krathwohl's taxonomy. Just a reminder, these taxonomies were used in choosing or selecting the verb appropriately that can be used appropriately in designing the intended learning outcome. So the verbs used is essential in designing the learning outcomes. Now, for the psychomotor domain, we have the Harrow's taxonomy. So it was described by Anita Harrows in 1972. So this taxonomy focuses on the development of physical fitness, agility, and the like to achieve a high level of expertise. So Harrow's taxonomy was described to degrees from having involuntary responses to reflex movements. Those are some of these aforementioned taxonomies were commonly used in choosing or selecting the verbs according to the level of the students in designing the intended learning outcome. So always bear in mind that verb is crucial in writing or creating the learning outcomes. So upon knowing the verb, let us now move on to the fourth step in writing the intended learning outcome, which is to add the context. So it is important to consider the place the unit occupies within the course structure and its contribution to student development towards the CLOs, just as when selecting verbs. As what I have said earlier, selecting verbs is crucial, as well as in adding the context in writing the learning outcomes. So in context, so when selecting the appropriate context, it is important to map the course learning outcomes or the CLOs to determine the most suitable context. Thus, the CLOs will be based on the purpose and content that the students needs to do in the course. So just like selecting the verbs, it is crucial to consider the place, the unit or coverage that is needed in the course and its contribution in achieving the CLOs. As what have been stated in my example, it was stated here the students will be able to explain the concept of objects in linear and rotational motion and the relationships between motion, force, and energy with reference to Newton's three laws of motion. So context in the example is to explain the concept of objects with reference to Newton's 3 laws of motion, and that is how you add the context in intended learning outcomes. Last step is to ensure the clarity. So to ensure that the I law is well written, the final step is to put the 3 elements together and ensure that the rule makes sense not to you as an expert but to your students who are novices in the area. So in ensuring clarity, we need to ensure that the intended learning outcomes are clear, specific, and feasible. So to ensure that the I law is well written, combine the elements together. So if we need to remove any jargon, replace it with simple language. So the three elements in writing the intended learning outcomes entails the verb, the content, and the context. So for a recap, the first element in designing a curriculum is the intended learning outcomes. So in designing the intended learning outcomes, there are 5 essential steps. We have the purpose, the content, the verb, the context, and lastly we have the fifth step. Fifth step is to ensure clarity. So upon knowing the element of the intended learning outcomes, let us now move on to the subject matter or content and references. So in selecting content, you should bear in mind the following principles. So it is the content of the lesson, including the topic or the subject, that will be discussed and covered. So in selecting the content, we should consider the following principles. First, subject matter should be relevant to the outcomes of the curriculum. So the subject matter should be purposive and focused on the learning outcomes. So to achieve the learning outcomes, the content of the lesson should be aligned with it. Next, subject matter should be appropriate to the level of the lesson or unit. So furthermore, the curriculum should lead the students towards building of previous lessons, meaning the learning should be continuous and the content must be appropriate according to the level of the learners. So the contents that are too easy or too difficult or too complex for the development of the learners will make them bored or confused as well. Lastly, subject matter should be up to date and if possible should reflect current knowledge and concepts. So the content should reflect current knowledge and concepts in which they can relate themselves. It can help the students to have a meaningful learning. Next, so for the references, the reference follows the content. It tells where the content or subject matter has been taken. I have here an example of a reference. So it may be a book, a module, or any publication. So the material must have an author and if possible the publication. So you can cite your references in APA or in MLA format, and in APA, in MLA, or in any other format that are accepted. The third element is the teaching and learning methods. So these are the activities where the learners derive experiences. It is always good to keep in mind the teaching strategies that students will experience. For example, the lectures, the laboratory classes, fieldwork, etc., and make them learn. So the teaching learning methods involve activities that promotes cooperation, competition as well, individualism, and independent learning amongst the students. So experiential activities will be beneficial for the students to learn. It can be through laboratory classes, fieldwork, etc. So I have here some of the teaching learning methods. First is the cooperative learning activities. So in here, it allows the students to work together. Students are guided to learn on their own to find solutions to their problems. So in here, the students or learners can learn from each other. The role of the teacher is just to guide the learners. Example of these activities covers or entails group projects and performances. Next, we have the independent learning activities. It allows the learners to develop personal responsibility. So these activities allow the students to improve their degree of independence to learn and how to learn. So in here, the student is responsible for their own learning. So this strategy is applicable for fast learners. Next, we have the competitive activities. It is where students will test their competencies against another in a healthy manner that will allow the learners to perform to their maximum. So it involves positive competitive activities that will test their competencies in various areas. So it allows them to perform at their best. Lastly, we have the blended learning activities. It is a combination of classroom and online education. I know that you are very much familiar with this. The rise of digital and mobile learning technology gave momentum in the use of blended learning. So it is where the students learn via electronic and via online media together with traditional face-to-face teaching. It is a combination of both online and offline learning. So some of the most common types of blended learning includes the flipped classroom, the hybrid learning, and the project-based blended learning. Lastly, for the last element of designing a curriculum is the assessment and evaluation. So for the assessment or the evaluation, the learning occurs most effectively when students receive feedback. In other words, when they have received information on what they have or have not already learned. So assessments and evaluation are essential for students to learn effectively. So the process by which the information is generated is what we call the assessment. So it has three main forms. First is the self-assessment, through which a student learns to monitor and evaluate their own learning. So in here, the student will become reflective and self-critical. Next, we have the peer assessment, in which students provide feedback on each other's learning. So it is viewed as an extension of the self-assessment. Students can learn from the criticisms or the feedback coming from their peers. Lastly, we have the teacher assessment. So it is when the teachers give feedbacks on the students' performance. Furthermore, assessments may be first formative. It is we're providing feedback to help the students learn more. The giving of feedbacks. It is the giving of feedbacks that allows the learners to learn better. Lastly, we have the summative assessment. This on expressing a judgment on the student's achievement by reference to a stated criteria. So it is this assessment focuses on stating a judgment on students' performance with the use of criteria. It is usually involves marks or grades that and entails decisions about the progress and performance of the students. Hence, all in all, in the assessment and evaluation, it is suggested by Bilbao, Lucido, Iringan, and Javier 2008 that summative tasks should include formative feedback. So, if possible, so that the students, we can say that the students can learn effectively. So, generally, all in all, in this discussion, we have tackled we dig deeper on the curriculum designing and organization. So we have tackled about the types of curriculum design that involves the subject-centered design, the learner-centered, and lastly, we have the problem-centered design. While in elements of designing a curriculum, we have tackled the 5 major elements in designing a curriculum that entails first the intended learning outcomes, the subject matter content and the references, the teaching and learning methods, and lastly the assessment or the evaluation. And that's the end of our discussion about our lesson about the curriculum planning, curriculum designing, and organization. I hope you learned something from me and thank you for listening. See you to our next discussion.